And then they find themselves ashore, and that's kind of where we left the story off. So we're going to look at this time on Malta, the island of Malta. That's where they ended up. And we're going to see what happened there, and we're going to ask this question, maybe why was this? And if there's a theme to this message, it has something to do with God's detours in life. God's detours. This was like a detour because they wanted to get to Rome, and then God sort of parked them on this little isolated island. Then we're going to look at, it's going to go from exegetical to subjective. We're going to think about this principle of God's detours in people's lives and do some case studies from Scripture. We're going to look at different people that had similar experiences as Paul did, where they were going in a certain direction and God stopped them or redirected them or just did something in their lives that just maybe didn't make a lot of sense. And then the third part of the sermon, we go back and look at those people and say, why? What was the fruit that came from these detours in their lives? So let's begin by just looking at this little event in Malta, on the island of Malta. We'll start by reading the first 6 verses and talk about them a little bit. Once safely ashore, we found that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire, welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging on from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer." For though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up suddenly and fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said, "He must be a god." Well, that's not the first time that happened. If you remember his first missionary journey, I can't remember, it was early in that, and they were doing these miracles, and Paul and Barnabas, and they thought Paul was Zeus and Barnabas was some other god. Of course, they had to make it clear that that was not the case. But this gives us a sense of what these people in Malta were like. They are actually, the word barbarian was used to describe them. Now, not in the sense that they were all like these, murderous type people. It simply meant that they were much more, we could use the word provincial. They had their own culture because, they'd been living, the people of Malta had been living by themselves on this island, probably fishermen. They weren't unfamiliar with Rome. We're going to see that there was a Roman governor who lived on this island as well. But the normal people, like they say about Vermont, you could live there 50 years and not be considered a Vermonter, unless you go back 100 years. So there was this, basic population. And these people were, we would call them more provincial or more like country folks. I had the privilege, and when I grew up, of kind of being involved in 2 different cultures. I grew up in not too far from here in Utica. Utica has all the stuff you experience in the city. We had people from different backgrounds, and I think half of Utica were Italian, and there were Jewish and African American and all this. And I got to experience all those different things in Utica. But on the summers, it was out to the farm, and where I learned all kinds of good things, like how to shovel manure and how to carry milk and how to drive tractors. And when I was 12 years old, I was out raking hay. And it's a different culture because when somebody drives by your house in the city, you don't even blink an eye. But when somebody drives along that little dirt road, along that farm, if you don't know who that is, that's worth talking about. I wonder who that person was that just drove by our house. This is the mentality. It's like a rural mentality. So these are the kind of people they were. But they were good people. You know, the word kindness shows up here. They showed kindness. And, you know, living there on an island, I'm sure they were very familiar with what it means to be in a shipwreck and how much sympathy they must have had for them. So that's kind of the situation. And I'm thinking God could have led them to any place, but he led them to this island of Malta, which if you look at the map was way kind of off course. And they never would have gotten there if there hadn't been this storm, because it's much farther west than they would have gone if they were just sailing directly to Rome. But God knows what he's doing, and that's going to be part of our theme, you know, in these detours, these life detours. So the cool part, anytime there's snakes, I get interested because snakes are cool. I remember going through a swampy area with my brother down in Virginia, and we were just looking for snakes and, you know, these big water moccasins. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. So snakes are cool. So anytime you get a snake in the story, it's really cool. This was called a viper. And I think the thing we have to keep in mind is the people, when they saw Paul getting bit by this viper, they knew what it was. There's a lot of, you know, theologians that will say, well, this was not a poisonous snake. So, you know, those people knew this was a poisonous snake. And, you know, they were sitting there taking bets. When is this guy going to keel over? But their common assumption was, you know, wasn't there somebody, the disciples were asking Jesus who sinned because this guy was, I should have looked that up, blind or something. I can't remember the details. But the assumption was, even amongst the disciples, he must have done something wrong. And that was the advice Job got, I think, from his first counselor. Job, you must have done something wrong, because nobody gets, you know, stuff like this happening to them unless they did something wrong. And this was the conclusion that they had. You know, these are kind of like superstitious folks that, you know, they sort of worked in the Roman and Greek gods into their worldview, and they just thought justice was this god of justice, I guess. And that because Paul must have done something wrong, that's why the snake bit him. So sitting there waiting for him to keel over, and then noticing and knowing that he was bitten, you know, this wasn't, they knew it, they saw it. That snake was attached firmly to him, and yet he doesn't die. So now the thinking changes a little bit. There's something special about this guy. And right away, Paul becomes a focal point of the island, seeing this miracle. Now, it's conceivably possible that maybe some of the Roman element there might have heard of Paul, you know, because by this time, after all these years of ministry, his name had gotten around and people understood who he was. That's why he was such an important prisoner, because he was such an influencer in the Roman Empire at that time. Well, anyway, this was an unplanned layover, or let's just call it a detour. That's basically what happens in this first section. Now, the next few verses, we read about the Roman element on the island in verses 7 to 10. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. These are the Romans. You know, Rome had its presence everywhere. They had this elaborate system of governors, and they just wanted to keep tabs on every part of the empire. So even this little island, I don't know if Publius seems to be kind of a sensible guy, and maybe in a way he's got a sweet job because he's just on this island, you know, in the Mediterranean. That could be cool. And not a lot's going on, so he doesn't have all these problems that some of the other governors do. You know, like back there in Judea, nobody wanted to be a governor of that area. But he seems to be a man who is looking for truth. So let's read that from verse 7 on. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us into his home. Remember, Luke is with them. He's there through all of this, and he's the one that's writing this, and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. And when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. And they honored us in many ways. And when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. So Publius was a Roman official. He was in charge of the island. And possibly when he heard about this whole cool thing with the snake, he was interested and said, I got to meet this guy, have him come. And, as soon as you meet Paul, his presence would just, be noticed, who he was. Not just even that the snake bit him and he survived, but beyond that, Paul had this authority. He had spiritual authority, just like he did on the boat when he said, essentially, he became the commander of the boat. And whatever he said, finally, people listened to and obeyed. So this was Paul, and his presence there in the home of Publius was, 3 days. He kept them there for 3 days. And by the way, they were on this island for 3 months. Remember, it was like probably November by the time this came, and that's why they had to find a fire to huddle around when they got there. And they weren't going to go anywhere because the Mediterranean was too dangerous in those next few months. So it's probably not like till March, like right about now. I hope it wasn't snowing there. I guess they were right. It is snowing a little bit. But this is, if you've been somewhere for 3 months, I know sometimes we'll go on vacation somewhere and I've never been there. And by the end of the week, the first week, you kind of get to know your way around and you're familiar with, how to get around and the people and some of the landmarks. They're there for 3 months. And this is a lot of time to get to know the people. And as we think about God's purpose for bringing them there, that's got to come into the equation, I think. But what were the fruits of Paul's stay, this detour? What did God accomplish by sending him there, putting him there? Well, first of all, the gospel comes to Malta. You got to wonder, Paul, when he went on his other missionary journeys, kind of went to the well-populated areas, and we don't know if anybody on this island ever heard the gospel before.